The Suez Canal has been the central hub of global trade for centuries. Not only does the lucrative trade between Europe and Asia pass through it, but it also connects the oil fields of the Middle East with the rest of the world. Just how important it is for the global economy was demonstrated in the year 2021 when the container ship Ever Given got stuck in the bottleneck for 5 days, briefly disrupting the entire global supply chain. But it was precisely in this context that a planned project from Israel gained a new place in the spotlight. Israel is planning to create a new alternative canal between the Red Sea and the Mediterranean. A true megaproject that could change global trade and the balance of power in the region forever. This project is not only intended to reduce dependence on the Suez Canal, but also to underpin Israel's rise as an indispensable regional power. So what is this daring project all about, when could it be completed, and how will it change the region forever? We take a look at all these exciting questions in today's video. To understand the motivation and importance of the planned canal, we first need to look back in history. Centuries ago, plans began for a link between the Red Sea and the Mediterranean to drastically shorten trade between Europe and Asia. After all, it is incredibly time-consuming and costly to transport goods over long distances by land. Although there was the legendary Silk Road, trade was already largely carried out by sea in the Middle Ages. However, there was only one possible way to transport the lucrative trade with India or China: the shipping route around the whole of Africa. This began in the European ports, ran along the West African coast, around the Cape of Good Hope at the southern tip of Africa, and then eastwards along the East African coast across the Indian Ocean to Asia. However, this route was considered very dangerous, as the ships often had to brave the rough seas and unpredictable weather conditions. In addition, the route sometimes took months and, despite numerous bases along the way, ships kept disappearing without a trace. And so, early on, alternative proposals were made to drastically shorten the route to Asia. After all, there had always been a geographical interface that seemed to be made for crossing: the Sinai Peninsula, which is surrounded on two sides by watersheds. The connecting line between Africa and Asia, and where the Mediterranean is only a few hundred kilometers away from the Red Sea. The Merchant Republic of Venice had already made a proposal to the Ottoman Empire to build a canal. And later Napoleon also took up the idea during his Egyptian campaign in order to disrupt British trade with India and become the ruler of Asian trade himself. However, his surveyors mistakenly came to the conclusion that the Red Sea was around 10 meters higher than the Mediterranean, making canal construction seem impossible with the technology of the time. The plans were therefore put on ice for several decades. However, Egypt later achieved relative independence under Muhammad Ali Pasha. And with him and his successor, Egypt pursued an expansive policy and ushered in the history of modern Egypt. This also included the resumption of building plans. With the help of the British and French, new surveys were carried out, which now gave the green light for such a construction project. Ideas for a canal both to the west of the Sinai and to the east were discussed, but it soon became clear that the western route was much simpler and shorter. And so the construction of the Suez Canal began in the year 1859 under the direction of Ferdinand de Lesseps, a French diplomat and engineer. The construction work took 10 years, and the canal was officially opened on November 17 of the year 1869. The completion of the Suez Canal was considered an enormous technical feat at the time. And the savings for ships amounted to several thousand nautical miles, which meant a reduction in travel time of weeks or even months, depending on the exact route and speed of the ship. This had a huge impact on global trade, as it shortened transportation times and facilitated trade relations between continents. But let's now jump forward a century in history. In the meantime, another regional power emerged alongside Egypt in the area surrounding the Sinai Peninsula: Israel. Founded after the Second World War under the supervision of the USA, the Jewish state quickly developed into a pioneer in economic and technological terms. However, it repeatedly came into conflict with its Arab neighbors. In the Six-Day War of 1967, Israel was even able to conquer territories such as the Sinai Peninsula and the Gaza Strip, but had to cede them again under international pressure. And so a plan was hatched early on to curb Egypt's power over global trade: the construction of its own canal. This was to run east of the Sinai Peninsula and flow into the Gulf of Aqaba in the Red Sea at the narrow point where Israel has access to the sea. The Ben Gurion Canal project, named after Israel's founding father and first Prime Minister David Ben Gurion, was to be wider than the Suez Canal and thus offer a genuine alternative to the Suez Canal. However, this initially seemed highly challenging in terms of technology. And so, in the year 1963, there was the incredible plan to use 520 underground nuclear explosions to aid the excavation process for the planned canal through the hills of the Negev Desert. This method was intended to facilitate and speed up the excavation work, but was ultimately not implemented. It was not until 1993 that this original plan was declassified and made available to the public. In the end, however, they did not want to take the risk of detonating over 500 atomic bombs, even though the canal trail runs through the largely deserted desert. And so the plan to build the canal disappeared into a drawer for several decades until it was dug up again a few years ago. Thanks to the latest technologies and the technological progress Israel has made, such an undertaking actually seems realistic today. In addition, Israel now has new allies who are also interested in such a channel. First and foremost are the United Arab Emirates, which want to transport their oil to Europe even faster and more efficiently. Then there is Israel's western neighbor Jordan and Egypt's eternal rival Ethiopia, which signed several agreements with Israel in the spring of this year that are also intended to advance the construction of the canal. Overall, there are numerous states that would be in favor of such an alternative canal. Egypt seems to be abusing its monopoly position time and again. Over the years, numerous shipping companies have complained that Cairo keeps increasing the tolls and the corresponding mooring fees for the passage of ships exponentially. This is because the world has no choice but to pay whatever the Egyptian Canal Authority demands. But an Israeli canal could spark new competition and lower the freight charges again. And so, on the 2nd of April in the year 2021, Israel announced its intention to build the canal, but without giving a specific date. But what will the route look like in detail? Starting at the southern end of Israel on the Gulf of Aqaba, the canal is to run through the Araba Valley for around 100 kilometers between the Negev Mountains and the Jordanian highlands. It then turns to the west before reaching the Dead Sea Basin, which is too deep below sea level. It will then run through a valley in the Negev Mountains before heading north again, bypassing the Gaza Strip and finally connecting with the Mediterranean Sea. In contrast to the Suez Canal, the Israeli canal will transport ships in both directions. This will be achieved by creating two parallel canals. Unlike the Suez Canal, which runs along sandy banks, the Israeli canal will also have rocky walls, which means that it will hardly require any maintenance. Israel is also planning to build small towns, hotels, restaurants and nightclubs along the canal to boost the local economy. The canal is also to be built significantly deeper and wider than the Suez Canal, which would allow even the world's largest cargo ships to pass through. Construction of the canal is expected to take around 5 years, which means it could be completed by the end of this decade. Depending on the source, the cost is estimated at between $60 and $55 billion. However, Israel assumes that the canal will generate annual revenues of around $6 billion or more. In addition, Israel will have the largest artery connecting the Mediterranean to the Red Sea, with trade between Europe and Asia continuing to grow. It would also underpin Israel's claim to be a regional power and mean a considerable increase in power for the small state. Global trade would certainly benefit greatly and Europe and Asia could grow even closer together.